Welcome back to the Grep News Podcast. I'm Bam Rather, and our show today is about a stunning allegation and a corporate gag order when a late-night host labeled a legal settlement as hush money, only to have his own network pull the plug on him speaking about it. So here's the thing about censorship in the modern age. It rarely arrives with jackboots and confiscated printing presses. More often, it comes in the form of a phone call from your network's legal department, delivered in careful corporate language, suggesting that perhaps it would be wise to reconsider that interview you had scheduled. And that's precisely what happened to Stephen Colbert this week. On Monday evening, Colbert opened the Late Show with an announcement that should concern anyone who believes in a free press. CBS lawyers had called him directly, in no uncertain terms, as he put it, to inform him he could not broadcast his scheduled interview with Texas Democratic Senate candidate James Talarico. Then, according to Colbert, they told him something even more remarkable. He couldn't mention that he'd been told not to air the interview. So naturally, being Stephen Colbert, he spent his opening monologue doing exactly that. The stated reason? The FCC's equal time rule. The actual reason? Well, that's where this story gets interesting. Let's back up. The equal time rule has existed for decades. It requires broadcast stations to provide comparable airtime to opposing candidates if requested. But here's the crucial part. It has always included a bona fide news exemption for news programs and talk show interviews. Late-night shows have operated under this exemption since the 1960s. Colbert himself noted he couldn't find a single example of the rule being enforced against a talk show interview in over 60 years. So what changed? In January, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr, appointed by President Trump, issued new guidance suggesting that late-night and daytime talk shows might no longer automatically qualify for that exemption. His reasoning? Some programs are motivated by partisan purposes. Notice the language there. Not violating broadcasting standards, not failing journalistic criteria. Motivated by partisan purposes. Which is interesting phrasing from someone who's openly admitted that conservative talk radio, the medium literally designed for partisan purposes, isn't being targeted by this enforcement. And that's when I realized what we're actually watching here. This isn't about the equal time rule. This is about the architecture of compliance. How power doesn't need to formally ban speech when it can simply make the cost of speaking too high. Consider the timeline. CBS parent company Paramount recently settled a $16 million lawsuit with Trump over edited 60 Minutes footage. Days after Colbert called that settlement a big fat bribe on air, CBS announced The Late Show would be canceled, citing financial reasons. Then Paramount won FCC approval for an $8 billion merger with Skydance, but only after agreeing to Carr's demand to install a bias monitor. A bias monitor. Let that phrase sit with you for a moment. We're talking about a major American media company agreeing to government-approved oversight of its content to secure regulatory approval for a business deal. So when CBS lawyers called Colbert about the Talarico interview, were they responding to actual legal requirements or preemptively capitulating to avoid regulatory complications? Here's where the story splits. CBS issued a statement claiming they merely provided legal guidance and that Colbert decided to post the interview on YouTube instead. But Colbert's account describes something far less voluntary, being told he could not air the interview, full stop. On Tuesday, he responded to CBS's statement by literally scrunching it up and putting it in a dog waste bag on camera. The thing is, multiple legal experts say CBS's interpretation of the equal time rule appears to be wrong. Harold Feld, senior vice president at Public Knowledge, stated flatly, if what Colbert says is true, CBS needs new lawyers. He pointed out that even under the strictest reading of the rule, only Talarico's Democratic primary opponents, not Republican candidates, would be entitled to equal time, and only if they actually requested it. CBS had no legal obligation to preemptively prevent the interview from airing. Think about that. CBS's lawyers gave guidance based on a rule that may not have even applied to avoid scrutiny from an FCC that hasn't formally changed any regulations in response to guidance from a chairman who's openly targeting shows critical of Trump while exempting conservative media. And notice what's missing from every single report on this story. Any evidence that Talarico's opponents actually requested equal time. No quotes from Representative Jasmine Crockett, his primary opponent, who CBS claimed would need equal airtime. No statements from Republican Senate candidates seeking their share of late-night coverage. Just CBS lawyers getting ahead of a problem that might not exist. FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez, the lone Democrat on the commission, called it what it is: corporate capitulation. She noted that CBS is fully protected under the First Amendment to determine what interviews it airs, making their decision to yield to political pressure all the more disappointing.
Building a new product? Temez Labs takes you from napkin sketch to the App Store. Trusted by Fortune 500s for quality, security, and speed. Book your free strategy session at temez.ai.
But here's the beautiful irony of attempted censorship in the digital age. CBS kept the interview off broadcast television, where Colbert typically reaches about 2.5 million viewers. So The Late Show posted it on YouTube instead, where it generated over 5 million views, roughly double his normal audience. Talarico's campaign reported raising $2.5 million in the 24 hours following the interview. It's almost as if the Streisand effect and the First Amendment had a baby, and that baby knows how to work social media. The broader implications, though, are chilling. This isn't an isolated incident. In September, ABC suspended Jimmy Kimmel Live indefinitely after Kimmel made sharp comments about conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Trump celebrated the suspension. ABC reinstated Kimmel after about a week, but the message was sent: step out of line, face consequences. What we're witnessing is the creation of a climate where networks self-censor, not because rules have changed, but because the threat of regulatory scrutiny is enough. You don't need to revoke broadcast licenses when you can make executives nervous about merger approvals. You don't need to formally narrow exemptions when vague guidance letters accomplish the same goal. Robert Kornrevier, chief counsel at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, noted that Carr is putting pressure on late-night talk shows critical of the Trump administration, while openly admitting that conservative talk radio is immune from the FCC's ire. That's not regulatory enforcement. That's selective punishment for disfavored speech. And here's what nobody's talking about. How many other interviews have been quietly canceled? How many political candidates, particularly Democrats in competitive races, have been kept off late-night television because networks are playing it safe? We only know about Colbert because he defied CBS and went public. How many hosts received similar calls and simply complied? Colbert's show ends in May anyway. He's got nothing to lose by burning bridges with CBS management. But what about journalists and hosts whose careers depend on staying in corporate good graces? What about the producers and bookers who decide it's easier to avoid political candidates altogether than navigate this minefield? The Texas primary is coming up in March. That means CBS's decision effectively silenced a candidate during the final weeks of his campaign, not through formal censorship, but through the soft power of corporate legal departments anticipating regulatory displeasure. For his part, Talarico framed the controversy perfectly. This is the party that ran against cancel culture, and now they're trying to control what we watch, what we say, what we read. And this is the most dangerous kind of cancel culture, the kind that comes from the top. There's something darkly amusing about Colbert's observation that he wished we could have put it on the show, where no one would have watched it. It's a joke, but it's also a window into how power actually works in media. CBS executives were so concerned about FCC scrutiny that they inadvertently created a far bigger story and gave Talarico's campaign exactly the kind of attention they were trying to avoid providing. The question isn't whether CBS had the legal right to make this decision. They probably did. The real question is why a major American media company with full First Amendment protections chose to capitulate to regulatory pressure that legal experts say was based on a misreading of rules that haven't even been formally changed. And the answer, I think, is simple. When you have $8 billion mergers pending FCC approval, when you've just settled a $16 million lawsuit with the president, when you've agreed to install a bias monitor to secure regulatory clearance. Editorial independence becomes a luxury you can't afford.
Oh, hey, friend. Do you like what you're hearing? Now you can have a ridiculously amazing podcast, too. Check out holler.studio to get yourself one today.
That's the real story here, not the equal time rule, not FCC guidance. The story is about how corporate consolidation and regulatory capture create conditions where censorship becomes voluntary, where networks silence themselves because the cost of speaking freely is measured in merger approvals and license renewals. Colbert's final show airs in May. He's spending his last months on air in open warfare with his own network, putting corporate statements in dog waste bags, and posting interviews on YouTube that CBS won't broadcast. It's not the ending anyone expected for a 21-season run, but maybe it's the ending we needed. Because someone has to say out loud what's happening here. Someone has to demonstrate that the threat of regulatory retaliation shouldn't be enough to silence journalism. Someone has to show that when corporate lawyers call with guidance that contradicts decades of precedent, the appropriate response is to ask why, and then tell your audience exactly what happened. The architecture of compliance is built on the assumption that most people will quietly go along, that networks will preemptively self-censor, that the mere threat of FCC scrutiny will be sufficient to keep critical voices off the air. Stephen Colbert just demonstrated what happens when someone refuses to play along. The interview got more attention, the candidate raised more money, and millions of people who might never have heard of James Talarico now know exactly who he is and why CBS didn't want you to hear from him. Sometimes the most effective resistance to censorship is simply refusing to be silent about it. Thank you for listening to GREP News. If you are enjoying our podcast, please follow the show. Give us a 5-star rating to help us grow, and learn more at grep.news. Until next time.
Grep News. Thomas.